Hello everyone. So this is the final video lecture of this week, the third lecture, which is about this new modes of settled life and consciousness of death in the Neolithic West Asia. We're going to go to a couple of sites in Western Asia to talk about the settled agricultural communities, the first settled agricultural communities in that geography finally, and we will wrap up our discussion this week. The first site that I want to talk about is in Jordan, called Ein Ghazal. This is an early Neolithic village that was discovered by accident, actually, during the construction of a highway. An archaeologist came across at the site called the Spring of the Ghazals, and it became very famous with a very specific collection of plaster statues that were discovered at this site that I will come back to in a little bit. So Ein Ghazal was built on the banks of the Zarqa River near Amman, Jordan. It's about 2 kilometers from its airport, at the site called Spring of the Ghazals, Ein Ghazal, and it was occupied in the period that we normally call pre-pottery Neolithic, the Neolithic episode that's kind of really on the earlier half without any pottery, but it was also occupied in the early pottery Neolithic, and archaeologists. What I want to sort of really emphasize about this site is a cache of an assemblage of statues. Clay statues, plaster statues that were actually discovered at the site in an enormous collection. Somehow, these statues were destroyed after the completion of their use, and they were. Because this was a rescue excavation, it was a salvage excavation. So and the road construction was moving fast. So what the archaeologists did is that they decided to box this whole area of the plaster statues. And excavated in lab conditions. And all of this was actually transported to the Smithsonian Institution for restoration. And after months and months of study, conservation, reconstruction, this was, which is illustrated in these images here. These plaster statues were exhibited in the Smithsonian in about 20 years ago. So very memorable. But it does bring really a fascinating question, and you can see that kind of box excavation of the Ein Ghazal statues in the lower left, and you can see some of the construction details of the statues. And these are very interesting large human statues that are and some of them are busts just made of plaster that are sort of really covering with a kind of a skeleton, and their faces, although they have these kind of really trunk-like bodies, they have very elaborately decorated, very elaborately detailed faces, which had been modeled on human skulls. These unique finds were uncovered, studied, and preserved, and then exhibited at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. What really fascinating thing about this is that archaeologists have hypothesized that these statues may have been used in some kind of a funerary ritual as effigies for dead ancestors, and carried during a ritual, and then dumped and smashed. Actually, when the archaeologists found them, they were in a cache, in an assemblage, in which they were deliberately smashed. This actually raises a very interesting question for curation and exhibition of archaeological artifacts, in the sense of what does it mean to take a number of ritual artifacts which were deliberately smashed and reconstitute them, rebuild them, and exhibit them. It's an interesting sort of really conservation question for us. This theme of consciousness of death, this interest in afterlife, and also in thinking about the sort of afterlife of dead people, is a really interesting feature of the Neolithic communities in the Middle East. And I wanted to, this is not to say that this is really not just in representations, but this kind of animal-human hybridity also found in the burial practices. And I'm showing you a really interesting cross-species burial, a mixed burial of human and animal bodies. It's a very powerful example. This was this burial was excavated at the site of Hilajon Tahtit in Israel, and it dates to about 10,000 BCE, locally known as the Natufian period. What we see here is the burial of an elderly woman who was buried with 50 tortoise shells. And some of her limbs were actually, some of her body parts were replaced by body parts of specific animals. For example, her forearm is replaced by a forearm of a wild boar, and some eagle wing bones, some marten skulls, and other sort of remains of an eagle and a leopard were actually integrated into her skeleton. This burial also speaks to my fourth argument, if you remember from the first video, that this kind of idea of consciousness of death, an unusual set of burial practices in which the bodies of the deceased ancestors are reconstituted with material interventions. The consciousness of death is further supported by a really solid body of evidence from multiple Neolithic sites in Anatolia and the Levant, the eastern Mediterranean coast, by these plastered skulls. So this example is excavated at the archaeological site of Jericho in Palestine, and dates to 8,000 to 7,000 BCE. Here what we have is a skull of a burial in which at some point people have opened up the grave, retrieved the skull, and sculpted the skull with clay and mud plaster, in a way refleshing, introducing a new form of flesh to the head, and the eyes were inlaid with shells as well. So this is really quite fascinating. What is the really meaning of this practice? And we see this actually in multiple sites across the Levant and Anatolia in the Western Asian Neolithic, particularly. And the idea that archaeologists have been working on is really this continued connection with dead ancestors, your dead grandmother, dead grandfather, who is brought up again and reanimated in a way through this kind of a process. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the Neolithic in general in Western Asia before we talk about Çatalhöyük, and I'll wrap up my lecture with Çatalhöyük. But what happens in the Neolithic? Why do we call the Neolithic a revolution? It really because we see a dramatic change in the lifestyles of people through this process of domestication of plants and animals. So, what are these different changes of transitioning from hunting-gathering lifestyles into more settled, year-round settled agricultural communities? First of all, we see new social relations appearing in the settled life as part of living in a big village, year-round relationships, political contestation, family rivalry, and so on. So the human communities are really starting to understand what it means to live in a society. Around this time, of course, when you start cultivating the land, your relationship with the land, with the landscape around you, with the environment, is also dramatically changed. So it's now partially cultivated. It's not an entirely hostile environment through which you have to move all the time. You also have your relationship with animals also go beyond the hunt. You are not really restricted to this kind of one-to-one relationship in terms of like hunting, but more about now with the domestication of sheep and goat and eventually cattle, you develop a much more intimate and kind of really long-term relationship living together with these animals. New agricultural technologies involve experimenting with wheat and barley. The process of domestication really takes a very, very long time, over 1,000 years, and eventually added with lentils and legumes. And so this is really a kind of a dramatic change. With the idea of preserving food, of course, comes pottery technologies. You start to make pots in order to cook food, serve food, but also storage becomes a really important aspect of everyday life. With settled villages, we're seeing changing architectural technologies, which means that you're no longer living in short-term campsites, but you are living with living and building mud brick houses, building with stone, building with mud brick. You're plastering, whitewashing, painting, doing wall paintings on walls. So there are all these new technologies that you're experimenting with in the architecture of the village, right? And so, and in this context, we actually see a dramatic really change in art. Which means in decorating your pottery, making figurines. These agricultural villages in the Neolithic are full of figurines. Almost every house has a figurine or two. We see sometimes architectural sculpture done with animal skulls and modeling animal skulls with horns and so on, with bucrania. And wall paintings and textile patterns as well. And in that house context, you also have new burial practices. This is entirely new. A lot of these Neolithic communities are actually burying their dead under the floor of their house, under the platforms on which they live. And so what does that mean is really archaeologists really doing statistical work with the burials under the houses suggests that maybe not everyone was being buried under the house, maybe much more close relatives, or there must have been some criteria. We don't exactly know, and we don't know what happened to the rest of the dead who were not buried under their houses. But clearly, burial is a very diligent and very important activity right here. And so I'm showing you a reconstruction of the of Neolithic Çatalhöyük, which is one of the really best known sites in the Middle East, particularly because of the sort of really long-term archaeological projects that took place here. There has been a tremendous amount of work since the 1950s in excavating this mound. It's called Çatalhöyük. It's a fork mound, means literally fork mound, because it's actually composed of two mounds. I want to pause here for just a second for describing what is an archaeological mound. And this is we're going to see a lot of sites that are in the Middle East, archaeological sites that are in the form of mounds. And so a mound, which is tel in Arabic, höyük in Turkish, tepe in Farsi, in Grey in Kurdish, all of the sort of regional languages. It's an earthen man-made hill that is composed of a layered accumulation of many centuries of building, rebuilding, and settled life. So if you cut a mound, like the picture in the bottom, if you cut the mound like a cake in the middle, you will see a really fascinating layering of all of these different episodes of habitation. And of course, the oldest habitations are going to be in the bottom, closer to the natural soil. And the most recent habitations and settlements would be on the very top. And sometimes, in order to strengthen the edge of the settlement, they also built walls. And you can see them on the left, bottom left as well. So that's an archaeological mound. And when archaeologists are investigating, they sink in these trenches and they study every single stratigraphic level, as we call them, and date each stratigraphic level based on different kinds of methodologies that include ceramic analysis, the artifact analysis, carbon-14 dating, and so on. Those are different methods that we will discuss later in the semester. So if you look at the history of archaeological research at Çatalhöyük, we can talk about two major phases of excavation. The first phase being sort of carried out by British archaeologist James Mallard in 1960s, 61 to 63, which actually made the site rather famous. James Mallard had a conflict with the Turkish government and he had to leave, and a new set of excavations started in 1993 and continued until recently. And actually excavations continue today as well by Turkish archaeologist Ian Hodder, led the longest sort of project at Çatalhöyük from 1993 to 2017, running a Stanford University-based project excavating these two mounds. And you can see the two mounds, the Çatalhöyük East and Çatalhöyük West. At some point during the life of the settlement, inhabitants of Çatalhöyük East abandoned the site and kind of really moved next door. So one important artifact that we know from Neolithic sites is obsidian. This is a kind of volcanic glass that became very valuable commodity, very valuable object for stone tools, for making various kinds of tools, particularly weapons like knives and arrowheads and so on. Because it's very sharp and it's strong and it can be shaped very beautifully. And so there are a number of obsidian sources, volcanic obsidian sources in the Middle East, and you can see them in the maps that I show you up on the screen. And you can tell that there's a Cappadocian sources, that's Görlüda with a red triangle and a blue triangle at Bingöl. You can see how those different sources, the obsidian that was actually sourced to those sites, are distributed. They're distributed both in the Levant, in Anatolia, all the way into Iran. And we can tell actually that obsidian was circulated pretty widely in Western Asia, perhaps being used as money. Actually, the Ian Hodder, who was the director of excavations at Çatalhöyük, once argued that this really worked like a credit card at that time. And I'm showing you one of the sort of really finest sort of finds in Çatalhöyük, an obsidian mirror that was actually found during the excavations. What does a typical Çatalhöyük house look like? It's really, we're looking at a fairly egalitarian society with roughly same-sized houses. So we don't have palaces, we don't have temples, we don't have the only thing or the only building type that we have in Çatalhöyük are houses, and of very similar size. And so these houses were basically a kind of single-story house, and you could also use the roof. The really interesting thing is that the houses don't have windows or doors. They were entered from top, as you can see from here, from the roof. And the flat roofs were also possibly used for daily food processing and different kinds of activities, going from to your neighbor and so on. And that hole through which you would climb into your building was also where the oven was, so the smoke could escape from that hole as well. And the house was organized in terms of these platforms, which were differentiated by their function. So sleeping, cooking, food processing, and there were some clean ones. There were some cultic and ritual platforms. These were differentiated by the way that they were treated. And some of these houses, actually many of these houses had featured ritual paraphernalia, such as those decorated with bucrania. You're seeing some furniture, some kind of really platforms that are decorated with plastered bull skulls, decorated with their horns as well. Archaeologists have found sort of leopard tooth that are kind of really put into the walls. And so what is the significance of this kind of really animal symbolism, the use of animal parts within these spaces? The scale, I love this photograph just to show you the scale of a particular house. And here three archaeologists, Louise, Dan, and Laurie, are working in building 49. And they're, as you can see, one of the archaeologists is excavating a little burial under one of the platforms, and you can see some wall paintings on the walls. and how you can see how big, how intimate, how actually small and how intimate that those spaces are. Here are some of the platforms with wild bullhorns that are decorated, and many of the houses, without so much differentiation, had some kind of a small ritual platform or small cultic section of their house, and the walls of the houses were mostly covered with wall paintings, and these wall paintings, sometimes white plastering, sometimes wall paintings, sometimes very simple sort of geometric decoration, but always kind of really these paintings were renewed year by year. There are walls that were excavated by archaeologists that had about 100 layers of different paintings and different layerings. So the maintenance of the house, probably they were sort of yearly renewed. So I'm showing you one of the elaborate hunting scenes that we're seeing with a number of individuals with these kind of leopard skin skirt-like garments, and are sort of teasing a bull, and with their sort of bows and arrows, and it's really quite fascinating. The scale of the bull is extraordinary. Another very famous painting that was actually excavated by James Mellart, but became very controversial in the way that it was interpreted by James Mellart as a city plan with a distant view of a volcanic mountain. There are volcanic mountains around Çatalhöyük, so the idea was that it was illustrating one of those. But more recent work has shown that this is actually a geometric pattern, and the what is understood as a mountain is in fact one of those leopard skin decorations. So leopards were somehow very important for Çatalhöyük. And I'm showing you more conservation work going on in these buildings. In Building 80, where archaeologists have found these sort of layers of plaster on which the same design was plastered over and over again multiple times, sort of really renewing the plaster every particular year. Building 77, where archaeologists discovered a row of handprints on the wall as well, and so this is the geometric pattern layers of plaster as well. Another really very important aspect of Çatalhöyük is its figurines. Somehow all of the houses, some are associated with a number of figurines. These are animal figurines, small animal figurines, some made very roughly handmade, some of them very elaborate and representationally fascinating. And I'm showing you some animal figurines on top left, and a nude female figurine on top right with a detachable head. And so the idea of the detachable head figurines is really quite interesting. What was the reason for that? That's another really debate, and this is one of the things perhaps we could discuss during our class on Thursday. And I'm showing you some more examples of the tiny little sort of animal figurines that were found in thousands at the site. One of the famous figurines is this woman who was excavated by James Mellart in 1960s, and it became rather famous, and it is currently in the Ankara Anatolian Civilizations Museum. It was excavated in a grain bin, and It's a nude, voluptuous woman who is a female figure who is sitting on a throne-like seat, flanked by two lions. And it's really quite fascinating and unique. We discussed this kind of idea of the bodily ideal in the first lecture. I wanted to bring this back in, and this is a clay figurine that became particularly powerful. And I will wrap up my lecture with this image of the most recently discovered marble figurine of this type, who, as you will remember, I hope, was buried under one of these platforms in the houses in 2 layers of clean sand and with the accompaniment of a little piece of obsidian. Now you understand the importance of the context, right? And so we talked about the house, the idea of burial of real human beings under the floor of your house. But then here's a miniature human made from marble, really beautifully carved. And it's being buried under one of those clean platforms, under one of those ritual platforms, in clean sand, with accompaniment of a piece of obsidian. There is something very powerful going on here that allows us to really think about this figurine as being very, very special in the life of someone who lived in Çatalhöyük around 7000 BC. So I will stop there, and I really look forward to our discussion on Thursday.